I don't know about you, but I am so ready for the Monster Manual to come out on February 18th. Like, past ready. Like, frustrated that I have to still wait ready. Unfortunately, I'm too small for Wizards of the Coast to send me an advance copy of these kinds of things, though if you want a sub to help me fix that, then, that'd be appreciated. But I do think that Wizards let some secrets out with another recent publication that gives us a huge dive into the Monster Manual and the changes that are going to be made, and the answers to some burning questions. Questions like, will there be more vulnerabilities? What's happening with bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing resistance? Are there going to be more NPCs? Will monsters be overcomplicated? And will monsters deal or be able to be dealt more damage? My name is Timothy, though some people do call me Tim. This is Lila, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. This is a place where we gather together to try to improve our games of Dungeons & Dragons, and I'm glad you're here, because there's always something that we can learn together about our favorite RPG, including perhaps what's next. The recent release of Scions of Elemental Evil is the source material we're using to try and get our sneak peek into the upcoming Monster Manual today. While these might not represent the final product that's going to be in the Monster Manual, they are specifically replacing the NPCs and creatures of the exact same name, and so I'd be surprised if Wizards is going to muddy the waters even more by creating another version of the same thing this close to release. So let's see if we can't answer our questions. When it comes to whether or not monsters are going to deal more damage or have a greater ability to take damage, we're basically just looking at overall damage output numbers and the hit points and armor class of the creatures when comparing their 2014 versions from the Monster Manual to the new ones from Scions of Elemental Evil. Though I did go through and look at every one of these combinations, I'll just highlight the biggest ones that sort of show, I think, a little bit of where things are going. Stone Golems saw a pretty huge difference with a 40% increase in their hit points, but the loss of physical resistance in order to make up for that. Their armor class went up slightly, just by 1, and they gained a roughly 25% boost to their damage output, as well as a ranged attack, which goodness knows they could sorely use. Meanwhile, in contrast, the Incubus remained unchanged in its hit points and armor class, and they also lost physical resistance, making them significantly more beatable at their CR4. However, where they used to deal 6 points of damage per round on average with their little claw, they now deal a whopping 30 for a 500% increase, as well as gaining a bonus action recharge ability that can tack on an average 18 more, or knock a weakened foe unconscious. These guys are the ultimate stalker kidnappers, and it certainly seems to make up for the loss of durability by making them a more glass cannon danger on the field. Meanwhile, the Cult Fanatic, now renamed the Cultist Fanatic, has had its hit points increased by about 33%, and while they took away its multi-attack with 2 wussy strikes of their dagger, they've now increased the damage that the dagger does to put them pretty much on around the same amount of damage dealing, just slightly more than it was before. They also lost access to inflict wounds, making them significantly less swingy in battle. The Knight, on the other hand, at CR3 remained largely unchanged in hit points and armor class, but had some buffs applied to increase the amount of damage that it was putting out. Their crossbow now does 2d10, and both of their attacks add a radiant 1d8 rider, giving them a net increase of about 40% to their damage output. Meanwhile, at CR2, the Ogre had its damage output left exactly the same as it was, but had their hit points increased slightly by about a 15% increase. So what can we come away with from these differences in the stats? I would say that it seems like there's been some effort to keep low CR creatures from becoming too overwhelming, but overall damage is definitely being increased from around CR3 onwards. Hit points does seem to be going up a little bit in order to balance low AC monsters, but the biggest changes center around the removal of physical resistance. And so what is happening with physical resistance? Well, in addition to the changes to the Incubus and Succubus just losing it and becoming more glass cannon-y and sort of controller at CR4. We have information from the Fire Elemental at level 5, who now has straight up physical resistance with no mention of non-magical attacks bypassing it. Meanwhile, as mentioned, the Stone Golem has lost its physical resistance, but had its hit points buffed accordingly. My takeaway is that all those folks who've been saying that physical resistance is no longer going to key off of magical weapons have been right all along. Damage types appear to be the be-all and end-all of 2024 D&D. While I'll admit I have some little grognardy moments in me that make me a little sad that a highly powerful magic weapon can no longer pierce a hide that couldn't be pierced before, I think that this is probably overall going to at least simplify things, and I'm willing to give it a shot and see how much I like it or don't in play, instead of just clinging to my old edition and pining for the days back when you had DR for magic weapons instead of the resistance properties. Resistance is certainly an elegant system otherwise, so it's definitely worth sticking to. Because when it comes to the elegance of the 5th edition system, overcomplication is pretty much the enemy. And speaking of the overcomplication of monsters, this is kind of a hard metric to judge, because everybody has different tolerances for complication in their monsters. I personally find many of the creatures from MCDM or Kobold Press to be a little bit too heavily focused on interconnected mechanics, to the point where you need to do more reading during the thick of things than I would prefer, but other people find those to be absolutely the peak of design performance. I'm not going to compare apples to oranges, so I won't be comparing these creatures in complexity to, say, Kobold Press or MCDM, but today we're just going to look at whether or not complication was either added or removed from the straight-up monsters that we have parallels to go by. I feel like Berserker was one example where it was streamlined a little bit, as the Reckless feature was removed in favor of simply putting a little line item into their attack routine that tells when they're going to get advantage. It's not quite as good as it used to be, but it also doesn't have the same downside that it used to, because honestly, a creature with such a low armor class didn't need to be offering up advantage anyway. The Stone Golem was slightly more complicated by having a ranged attack added to its stat block just to fill in that weakness. The Knight saw some of the biggest changes with the removal of Brave and Leadership, but had the addition of a damage type to its melee attacks. And the Cultist Fanatic had the removal of a bunch of their different spell options, bringing it in line with the newer design, and then had its 2 multi-attacks reduced down to a single attack with 2 damage types. My takeaway, it does look like they're trying to complicate monsters just to the point where they can address any specific weaknesses that it has, but it seems clear that the design team's goal of simplicity in their monster designs is still a big driving force, and I think that that's great. The Succubus and the Incubus are examples in this free adventure of monsters that have been made perhaps slightly more complicated, and they're still fairly reasonable compared to some of the creatures out there in Homebrew Land. Personally, I think that simple base monsters gives us more room to create on top of those than if we have something truly crazy that's already complicated out of the gate. What do you think? Of course, there's also the question of whether or not there's going to be enough new NPCs. If you're anything like me, you find it sometimes frustrating that we don't just have an easy go-to option for NPCs where we can have them already scaled up to deal with the different levels of our players. I run campaigns all the way to level 20, and having a CR1 quarter guard go ahead and try to arrest your level 20 adventurer gets a little bit old after about the first time of the amusement factor of it all. In Scions, we have a look at the tough boss, who seems very much to be a pretty clearly upscaled thug NPC. With pack tactics and a heavy crossbow, the basis is still there, and then they just built a little bit more on it to buff it up and bring it up to the CR that they were looking for. Having the Cult Fanatic's name changed to Cultist Fanatic in order to bring it in line with the lower CR Cultist seems like another nod towards creating these families that we've talked about. Likewise, you can see by looking at the stat blocks that their damage progression has also had a sort of unifying factor, as the Cultist now deals 1 1 point, and only 1 point, of necrotic damage on its attacks, and the Cultist Fanatic adds a d6 of the same extra damage type on its attack rolls. Meanwhile, Pirates have been added into this one, taking inspiration from the pirates from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, but while in Ghosts of Saltmarsh the CRs were tightly tied in from CR1/2 to CR2, the two we have here are CR1 and CR6 respectively, definitely broadening the opportunities and horizons of our seagoing battles. And so in Takeaways, I think that it looks like we will be seeing more NPCs and more scale and breadth of CRs amongst those NPCs in the upcoming Monster Manual, which I'm fabulously excited about. The really big question is how much of a range will these CRs cover for these individual monster families in the NPC category? Will we see a pirate lord that's suitable for the third tier play, or will we get a cultist leader that's going to push them into mid tiers? Unfortunately, we're going to have to wait until the book comes out to know for sure. When talking about vulnerabilities, on the other hand, we have a few answers now. It's been a long-term complaint that there aren't enough vulnerabilities in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It's super exciting when there's a vulnerability on the table, but their math on it does make it challenging, especially if players happen to just know the books inside and out, and thus are going to be able to defeat monsters handily with readily available spells. It also, of course, doesn't exactly highlight the martial unless there are some nice vulnerabilities to physical damage, like bludgeoning versus skeletons and stuff like that. But by and large, because of how much more exciting it is to see those huge numbers pop up, I'm a big fan of vulnerabilities, and I have been hoping that we would see a few more at least scattered throughout the book. And it seems like that might be the case. Fire elementals, despite now having resistance to all physical damage, are gaining vulnerability to cold damage. That includes the cold damage they take when they are doused in water, of course. Unfortunately, that is the only vulnerability that was revealed in this list, but the fact that they've added this in shows that the team is at least looking for opportunities to sneak these vulnerabilities in. But I think that the change by giving them physical resistance that doesn't get overcome by magic weapons, and then a vulnerability to highlight somebody who can deal out cold damage, is a cool way of doing it. It makes them a tough, difficult foe for certain groups, but if you can bring along the right tools, then the monster goes down. And that's really what we're looking for, is that monster hunter feeling of overcoming a foe by finding its weakness and exploiting the crap out of it until the bad guy dies. Though those are my answers to the questions I posed at the start of this video, there are a couple of other new things that I think are worth talking about. They added gear lists onto NPCs so that you didn't have to parse through the attacks section and the armor class in order to figure out what kind of gear your bad guy was wielding against you. And I think that's a nice start. It'd be nice if there were some treasure lists for monsters too, but maybe they'll put that in the fluff section of the character sheet and off the stat block, which I think would be good. Having the gear list on the stat block seems like it muddies it up just a little bit, but it is only about one line for the most part, and it's not probably going to make or break the entire system. I don't know how necessary I feel like it is or isn't, though it's certainly a simplicity, quality of life option. What do you think? Similarly, I kind of liked noticing how the cultist had a weapon that they used that dealt their tiny little bit of damage from magic adjacent to it, but the cultist fanatic didn't have a weapon listed because they used a pact weapon, giving them that little flavor of summoning up their weapon in order to go into battle, even though it wasn't otherwise mentioned anywhere in the stat block. In addition to gear lists, there was a little change to the gray ooze with the opportunity to fix armor that had been damaged by their acid attacks. Not only that, but an in-combat option using the utilize action and highlighting a tool proficiency. I really love the idea of armor sizzling away on people's bodies as they're being overwhelmed by oozes, and it really makes me want to run a horde of ooze encounter now, to where repairs in battle might actually be important. Sounds fun to me. There's also a really neat rework of the succubus and incubus, which typically were kind of a mixed stat block that didn't have enough difference to really be worth it. It was just sort of a male versus female, whereas now they are significantly and substantially different, but can transform from one into the other on a long rest, with one of them having a whopping amount of damage dealing capability and the other one having massive control aspects. I think that this was a nice attempt attempt to differentiate the creatures and link them together in a fun way that allowed them to be used a little bit differently at the table than they were in the past. Both their skill sets seem very on brand, and I'm excited to put them into play. So what do you think of my takeaways? Do they seem logical to you? Is it a good set of changes that are being made by Wizards of the Coast? I'd love to chat about it in the comment section, but for now, here's some video of my cats being, well, cats. Thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.